context, social emotional life skills, and then transition to post-secondary education. So these are where we've gone in and integrated those things more fully into this model that we hope living. And so when you, again, think back to the transition research and how the models and whatnot, we talk about these things sort of like we have the practices at the macro level, and these levels align with the predictors that we work with. So what's a macro level? It's a generic term. So self-determination skills, paid employment, family engagement, having a career counseling, having a transition plan. These are macro level practices. They're at the system level. Programs need to be providing these things, and they have these sort of generic names like I just described. But again, it doesn't tell you how to do paid work experience in Taos, New Mexico, or Los Angeles, California, or Miami, Key West, Florida. So we have to then, with kids with intellectual disabilities, we have to then look at the micro level to identify specific interventions within those broader categories at the macro level. And so we think about them in intact sort of like this. So when you're thinking about predictors that we've identified through correlational research or through other experimental designs, manual correlational research, that's what we're looking at, the systems, the programs, the generic practices. When we think about practices, then we're getting down to specific interventions. What kind of evidence do we have for specific interventions in specific contexts with specific groups of students? So when you look at the Taxonomy 2.0, you're going to find those macro level things. And they're going to be quite in detail. When you start flipping through your pages, you'll see those practices, but it doesn't tell you still how to do a specific intervention with specific kids. And that's where you can go to our transitionta.org website, and because we have a lot of information there on the evidence-based and promising practices. So I'm just going to go through these next slides really quickly, and then Catherine and June can come talk about those specific resources around specific practices. Just want you to understand what we mean. So student-focused planning is the process that we use to develop students' IPs, to make plans for the future. How we do it, who does it, how you foster it. Student development is the stuff of the educational program. So what is it that students are going to learn? So work skills, academic skills, social behavior, emotional skills, and very specific skills within those. We can't say that a student has can self-advocate to the post-secondary student services office and say also that that means they have self-determination. It doesn't. It means they can advocate for themselves. It's only one piece of self-determination. So you have to think about all that drilling down in there. And as we know, different kids learn in different ways. So when we think about the educational context, that's what we're talking about. Okay, interagency calculation is the content for the context for identifying and meeting the students and the family's needs. So we collaborate because we can't be the all, whatever that is, end all, be all. No one agency is the all, be all, end all, or has the resources to do that. Family involvement, we really have to think about that as a thread that runs through all of these things, because if we're not including families, engaging families in all those pieces of student-focused planning, student development, guess what? You have no context for what you're doing. And it's so interesting because I did teach this class, used to teach this class at Western, and it was on issues in special education. And it was required for our master's students, and if you were a doc student that had done it as a master's, you had to take it as a doc student too. Okay, so I used a book called Minority Students in Special and Gifted Education. It was a report published by the National Academies Press. It was back in 2002, so if you go to it now, it's a bit dated. But they asked 4 research questions around, is there some sort of genetic relationship with being identified, having a disability. So, what is the sort of medical basis for disability? They then wanted to know how do students get into special and gifted ed? How do you end up there? And it's so interesting. They had a story on NPR this morning where there's a state, I don't remember, it might have been Texas, and 8% of students in Texas are identified and they have IEPs. And that seems very low compared to most places. So fewer disabilities in Texas. Well, they're evidently raising some questions about that. So we have some states that over-identify particular populations of students. In this case, we might be under-identifying. And the focus was that they didn't do an assessment for special ed unless it was requested by the parent, which is also really interesting. So, but in this study, they wanted to know how do kids end up in special ed. And I can't remember all of them. Another question was, well, if there's a benefit, is there a benefit to being in special ed? So if you're supposed to get, customized education, all these services, etc., why would it be a problem to be in special education? So they looked at that too. Okay, so when I would use this book, and I had all these teachers from around, I don't know, hour and a half away from Kalamazoo, Michigan, they came in, they would just finally do these ahas because there's so much of this associated with poverty and the age of when you give birth. But poverty was a huge thread that runs through with the social disabilities, the learning disabilities, the cognitive impairment disabilities, not the medically based like hearing impairment and physical impairments and vision, blindness or vision. Those, and really significant disabilities, there is a relationship there. And those are, if you look at those populations, it's ethnically diverse, just like the population. If you look at the socially defined disabilities, they're not. We have more men, more boys, we have more African Americans, et cetera, fewer Asians, et cetera. Okay, but what people would say when they start thinking about this? Oh, I just thought my kids didn't care. That's why they didn't come to the school meetings. That's why they didn't come to parent conference, because they don't care about their kids. And so now they started thinking, well, you know what? They are on the lower SES. They're probably working 2 jobs. Or they have no one to take care of their other kids because they're not going to hire somebody to do that. They started thinking a different way about why their families might be engaged. So it was cool that they started thinking about that, but it's pretty scary, the assumptions that they made before thinking about that. Okay, program structures provide the infrastructure that facilitates the implementation of education practices. If you don't have that in place, we did 2 studies that looked at the importance of the things. Okay, self-determination in students was always ranked number 1, but all the other practices in program structures were second on the list. Because if that doesn't exist, it's not happening. Okay, so again, here's thinking about the process, because what I want to do is I want to challenge everybody in this room to find yourself in this process. So, how many people are your professionals and work in districts or the schools or places like that or agencies? Yes, okay, good. So, this all started when I had to be a transition specialist and say, what do we do in our program? What works? You want us to build a program? What does it look like? So ask those questions. When you come to challenges in what you're doing, ask those questions. And that will lead to finding the answers. And if you don't find the answers, then you can start studying and filling in the answers for other people. Because then this leads to program development, analysis, evaluation. Looking at, one of the things we looked at was, why are programs identified as exemplary? What makes them so good? Is it just because they're friends of the identifier? Sometimes. What's happening in post-secondary ed? What's happening in secondary ed? And that's where we developed the taxonomy, because asking these questions, doing these studies, led us to come up with something. We also looked at outcomes, student satisfaction, using anti-work incentives, those are other studies that we've done that'll say, help us understand the context. We've looked at work-based education, occupational programs, post-school outcomes, counseling strategies, self-determination. These are the kinds of things that came out of asking those questions. So that's what I want to challenge people to do. And then secondly, well, okay, we've got this now, how do you do it? How do you actually get a school to change? How do you actually get a state department interested in making schools change? Okay, and that's when you start influencing what's going on. Because you can talk about policy, you can talk about fostering program development, we can prepare leaders. So how many of you are in universities? Or doing teacher education and things like that? Okay, there you go. Teachers have to know these things. I hate to say, I just left Western Michigan and moved to UCF, and in the midst of me not being in the department, they did away with the undergrad transition course. Because they're gonna embed it. Okay. I'm not a believer. Embedding's good, but not if it just gets 1 or 2 weeks of instruction out of the whole course. Okay, think about that. Okay, so where are you going to find the taxonomy 2.2? So if we embed this in those tools that we use to foster state and local planning, it's embedded there. So those of you who are at state level or state teams, come to our capacity building institute.